this is Buddhism in a nutshell. And this is the third class out of 4. And so in the first class, we did an intro. We talked about the life of Buddha, how Buddhism spread around the world. The second class, we began speaking of the Four Noble Truths, which is the most fundamental, deepest part of Buddhism. And this class, but we didn't finish. So in this class, we're going to do the second half of that, and then we're going to move and talk mainly about the Mahayana path and bodhicitta and all of that sort of stuff. And then in the fourth and final class, we'll talk about some additional topics that extend Mahayana, like Tantric Buddhism, which is an extension of the Mahayana path, mind training, which is another special practice of the Mahayana. And also we'll talk about emptiness more specifically, which is a major topic, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, but actually in all Buddhism, although different Buddhists sort of give a different name, selflessness or emptiness or whatever. So anyway, that's where we are, just to put us all in context. So just briefly to review, so the Four Noble Truths that we talked about are true suffering, true cause, true cessation, and true path. And as we talked about the noble path of true suffering, we just talked about how suffering is pervasive in all of our lives. Not only physical suffering, but also mental suffering. But more specifically, the thing that Buddha really picked up on is that even pleasurable things also are suffering because they always change. You can't hang on to them. You can't, everything in our lives, what we call samsara more generally, but everything in our world constantly changes. And it's a suffering. If you have something really wonderful and you have to give that up, that's a form of suffering. And that's inevitable because if everything changes, you can't hang on to anything. And so what all of us are really doing in our lives are looking for permanent happiness. And permanent happiness is sort of the inverse of suffering. But we always focus on suffering because suffering bothers people more. If I gave you two things, if I said, well, I want to get rid of your suffering, or I want to make you perfectly happy, most people would choose, first of all, get rid of all my suffering, because suffering is more disturbing to them. And so basically what Buddha's path is designed is to remove all of our suffering. And that's what the Four Noble Truths are about, because Buddha discovered that it is possible to remove all suffering permanently, forever. And that's what nirvana is, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. And so you ask, how does this work? Why is it possible to remove all suffering? And the reason why it's possible to remove all suffering is because there's a cause of suffering. And that's the key thing that Buddha discovered. There is a real cause of suffering. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But because there is a cause of suffering, it means that if you remove that cause, then you will never suffer ever again. So the logic is very, very simple. It's like there's a cause of suffering. Actually, in Buddhism, everything is cause and effect. Everything in our world is cause and effect. There are no random events. Everything, if we could see, most of the time we can't see things. So it appears random, but there actually is a cause for everything. And that actually is very helpful when you study Buddhism, because it actually sort of helps you understand a lot of things. But in terms of the Four Noble Truths, like I say, if there's a cause of suffering, if you can figure out how to remove that cause, then you can cease it forever. And what Buddha discovered is that it is possible to remove that cause. And he says that for himself, he was able to do that. And so not only is it, so it's not theoretical, it's not a theoretical idea, it's something that Buddha himself did, experienced for himself. And what Buddha said is, he said, there's a way that I achieved this. And that's the fourth noble truth, that there's a true path or a method for removing the cause of suffering. And what Buddha said is that actually his job is really to just point out that path, to tell it to us, to show it to us. And he said, in exactly the same way that I followed this path and removed all of my suffering and achieved full enlightenment or nirvana. If you follow exactly the same path I followed, then there's no doubt you have to become enlightened, because everything is cause and effect. So if you remove the causes for suffering, it has to happen that it works, that they're gone. And so that's the sort of the simple logic of the Four Noble Truths. And again, and as in everything in Buddhism, Buddhism is all about experiencing for yourself this. Buddha always said, don't believe me because I'm the Buddha. You need to experience it yourself. And there's actually a deeper reason why you need to experience it yourself. And that reason is the real hangup, ultimately, is our own minds. It's our own minds that are really the problem. And that's what I'm going to go deeper into more. And so that's why you have to experience it yourself. And that's why Buddha said that, I can't wave a magic flag and remove your suffering. I can't do some, ritual, wave my hands, bless you or something, and remove your suffering, because you cause your own suffering. And if you are causing your own suffering, only you can remove and change your suffering. And so, and how you remove and change your suffering is learning how to change your mind. Essentially, learning how to remove all of the negative aspects of your mind and fill it with positive aspects instead. And of course, there's a lot of detail in how you do that. You can't think, oh, I want all this negativity's gone and that's it. It doesn't happen that way. You actually, you have to go through a process, and you have to go through a process of changing your mind. But I think the good news is that the other thing that Buddha always talked about is that Buddhism is a gradual path. I think somewhere in the backs of our minds, when people first hear about enlightenment, and the picture, I think the image that comes into everybody's mind when they think about enlightenment is, one of these little chain light bulbs. You pull the chain and the light bulb goes on, and it's sort of like this instantaneous change. There's no light. You pull the chain, the light goes on, and you are enlightened. And what Buddha really emphasized was that's not how Buddhism works, because essentially all of these negative aspects of our mind you should think of as bad habits. It's bad habits, and we can talk about rebirth and so forth, that even more than this life, it's bad habits over a long period of time. And it's like, and if you know anything about your own habits, even in ordinary life, you know that those habits become sort of firmly entrenched. And it takes work and effort to sort of nudge yourself out of those, those deep pathways and sort of escape from that. And so that's why Buddhism takes a while, because you have to gradually change your mind. But it is all cumulative. Each little change helps you do the next little change and so forth. And so you shouldn't despair that it's hopeless, because it really is almost like a rolling ball that once you set it in motion, it sort of helps maintain itself in motion. And as it rolls faster and faster, it gets easier and easier. So like everything in life, beginnings are always hard. But if you have the patience just to keep working at it, eventually it will get easier. And the good news is that what really happens in enlightenment, you can talk about enlightenment in different ways, and we're going to spend a little bit more time today exploring what we mean by enlightenment. In some ways, it's hard to talk about because it's beyond our experience. And how do you talk about something we've never experienced? We don't have words for it, so to speak, because all our words are designed to refer to our experiences and used in common. But one way of talking about it is enlightenment is a perfectly pure mind, a mind that has no negativities in it. And so one way of seeing how Buddhism can be gradual and continual is to see that, we have all these impurities. We can gradually remove impurities. We can gradually purify our mind. And sometimes Buddha even referred to this in analogies. It's like taking a dirty cloth and gradually washing it and rewashing it, getting it cleaner and cleaner. And essentially what you're doing as it gets cleaner and cleaner, essentially you're approaching enlightenment. And the good news about it is that since it's these negativities that cause all of our suffering, and most of our suffering, quite frankly, is mental. So as we as we purify our mind, actually we gradually get happier and happier. We gradually reduce our negativities, our unhappiness, our suffering. And so you can think about it as a continual way of gradually approaching enlightenment. And then, of course, at a certain point, you're completely pure. And that's when the light bulb goes off and you're fully enlightened. But it's more like you inch up to it first. So just before you become enlightened, you're actually extremely close, and it's very similar. And so that's the way it works. And what Buddha also said is that Buddha said that you can actually watch this process for yourself. And, again, you don't have to believe me. You can have the experiences where you decide for yourself that all of these teachings are really true and helpful. And in fact, that's the goal, because whenever you listen to somebody, there's always sort of in the back of your mind thinking, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. And when you're in that sort of mind where it's sort of wishy-washy, it actually doesn't act to remove anything. You need sort of a certainty in your mind. And it's actually understanding which actually ultimately removes all of these negativities. And I can explain that in sort of a simple analogy. Imagine having this extremely hot stove, absolutely cast iron stove. For adults, we would never put our hand on that stove because the pain would be so horrible. The pain of burning your hand is extremely horrible. And we have enough experience to know that, no, you don't want to go there. So for us, we don't have a problem as an adult. We wouldn't even think of putting our hand there. However, a young child with no experience, that has no understanding of what it's like to burn your hands or whatever, might put their hand right on the stove without even thinking about it and then suffer horrible pain. And that's how it works. I mean, most of us in our ordinary state lack understanding. So we lack the understanding of how this world that surrounds us is actually leading us through all this suffering. We lack the understanding to see how these negativities in our mind cause our suffering. And for that reason, we're like the young child who blindly goes ahead and touches the hot stove and we suffer. And then we're stupid again. We see another hot stove. Again, we touch it. And so we suffer over and over again. And so in a certain sense, it's that understanding. If you understand how the world really works, you wouldn't even think of doing anything negative. So it's not as though there's a commandment that says thou shalt not, have a negative mind. It's more like you understand how the world works. And people who have deep understanding would not in their right mind do anything that obviously hurts them. So in a sense, that's the way Buddhism works. And that's why it's ultimately wisdom that causes you to become enlightened, to remove your negativities. But it's a process, and you have to work through that. And most of the process involves your mind. And so because it does involve your mind, it really, Buddhism is really about changing your mind. So you can ask, how can you change your mind? And I would say that the deepest tool, the best tool we have is actually meditation. And that's actually what the Buddha said over and over again to his monks. He said, look, there's empty places here, there's trees, there's empty huts. Whatever you do, go out and meditate, because if you don't, you're going to really regret it. Because it's with meditation that we can actually see the world as it really is. And the Buddha actually explicitly says that. The Buddha says, in meditation, you see the world as it really is. And once you see the world as it really is, it irrevocably changes you. And as you see it, yeah, go ahead, Donnie. Okay. Sorry, Anna.
Thank you. And sorry, Bob, what do you specifically mean by meditation? Is it Shamatha meditation or certain practice or?
Yes, that's a very good question. Okay, so essentially in Buddhism, meditation basically comes in two forms. There's actually as you know, there's whole courses in meditation. There's millions of types of meditation, but I think it's very helpful to boil it down to two forms. And that's basically what Buddha himself did. Buddha talked mainly about two forms of Buddha. So he talked about what he called jhanas, which is in the Pali language, a derivative of Sanskrit. And these are what I would call single-pointed concentration. And that's one form. And the second form is what's usually called mindfulness meditation, vipassana meditation, things like that. And so I of course I can't give a meditation course, but in a nutshell, the way these work is in the single-pointed meditation, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, what they explain is you pick a topic, maybe compassion, maybe any Buddhist topic, any virtuous topic, and then you think about it, you contemplate it, you try to get it very clear in your mind what this idea is, or it can also be a feeling. So if it's like compassion, it can maybe be a feeling. So if it's a feeling, you try to really generate that feeling as clearly as possible. So because you have to know your object of meditation. Because if you're going to do single-pointed meditation, you gotta really pin down that object. So once you really got it pinned down, and they also say that this sort of contemplation, which is a form of thinking around it, thinking of examples, remembering the teachings, whatever it takes to clearly get your object in mind. So you do that. So then once you've got it really clear in your mind what you want to meditate on, then you hold that object single-pointedly. You just hold it in your mind. You don't think about it. You don't use any words. So it's completely wordless meditation. It's just holding that object in your mind. And of course, invariably what will happen is you will get distracted. And when you get distracted, when you notice it, hopefully soon, some people fall asleep, some people meander in large things for hours before remembering that they've left it. But anyway, as you get better in meditation, you get quicker. And when you notice that you've lost it, then you return to that object. And sometimes you have to redo this contemplation to get it clear in your mind again. And sometimes if it's a short time, you can just immediately go back to it and hold it. But this so that's what single-pointed meditation, it is just holding it. The way most people begin with this is a breathing meditation, where you learn to just single-pointedly focus on your breath. Okay, and this kind of meditation is extremely powerful. This is the sort of thing that leads to very deep levels of concentration, where you can actually even develop miracle powers and all sorts of exotic stuff. This is the thing, and so the purpose of this meditation is to develop a powerful mind, a mind that does not get distracted, a mind that can hold an object forever and never get distracted. And the great meditators, they can literally go days, months, years with never getting distracted. For us, we're lucky if we can last 2 seconds, but that's enough. But it's just practice, it's just practice. You just practice over and over again, and over a long period of time, you get better. And there are ways also, these distractions sometimes are called hindrances. There are techniques for actually working on these distractions themselves to actually try to get better at reducing them. But anyway, that's a whole course in meditation. So that's the idea of single-pointed meditation. And what's amazing about this thing is you think, well, what good does that do you? Just to hold this object in your mind. And it does, as I was saying, the one thing it does do is it improves your powers of concentration. And so that's one thing it does. It's like a skill. And your mind becomes so powerful that it has almost like a laser-like sharpness and focus to it. And with that focus, you can then, once you develop that ability to focus so intensely, you can turn that object of focus to any object you want and penetrate it very deeply. And as you just hold that object in your mind, it's amazing. You start to develop realizations. You start to understand that object in a deep way, so way beyond any way you ever thought possible. So that's how single-pointed meditation works. And the second type of meditation, which the Buddha in his lifetime actually talked about sometimes this mindfulness. He sometimes called it the one way or the only way to enlightenment, but it's unclear what it has the word one in it, eka, the Sanskrit word for one, but it's not clear if it's the only way or one way. But anyway, it's sort of a main path. And this is something that the Vipassana people in the United States heavily emphasize. It's not so heavily emphasized in Tibetan Buddhism, although they do mention it. But in Buddha's lifetime, it was a major thing. And actually, the two of these things go hand in hand. So in the Vipassana or mindfulness meditation, it's more, the normal way you do it is you focus on your breath. And you focus, and then whatever comes up in your mind as you're focusing on that, you see it clearly. You see if there's a feeling in your body, you watch every aspect of your breath in great detail. You're aware of every little detail. And essentially it's staying exactly in the moment, being not thinking about anything, but just being totally aware. And it's an awareness that's done sort of in the third person. It's sort of like, oh, there's a pain in my arm, or there's a pain in my leg, or oh, there's breathing that's rough, that's disruptive, or there's breathing that's smooth. You should imagine as though you're a Martian who can peer into your mind and see all these things bubbling up. And if an emotion comes up, it's like, oh, there's love in this mind. Oh, hatred is arising. Oh, irritation is arising. So you should think of, what you don't want to do is you don't want to think, I feel this irritation. Because as soon as you start doing that, you start grasping at it. You start clinging to it. And when you do that, then it becomes sort of like just a rumination and you don't get anywhere. Because our goal is to objectively see what's going on. So we have to be in an objective frame of mind. So it's very critical to actually just see everything completely objective, exactly as it is. And in Buddhism, there is a notion that, we'll talk more about the delusions, we have a tendency to exaggerate everything that happens. We have a tendency our ego gets involved with all of our experiences, and what we like or dislike affects how we experience the world. And this mindfulness meditation is meant to be a bare mindfulness, where you don't add any of these extra things from our own mind. You don't add anything to the experience itself. You just directly see it. Oh, you see physical things happening, arising. You see feelings arising. You see thoughts arising. And you see the objects, perceptions of the world and thoughts arising. And you just try to see these exactly as they are without adding anything to them, adding what in early Buddhism, they sometimes call it proliferations, because we're proliferating all this other junk on top of it. Okay. And it's really, and the two of these meditations go together because you want to sort of alternate them. You want to do some single pointedness to develop your ability to concentrate, to remove your distractions, because you will get distracted in this mindfulness also. And in the mindfulness, what you do is when a feeling or a thought pops up, you simply note it. You don't note it verbally. You don't say, oh, hatred is rising, but you're just aware of it. You're just aware of this feeling being present. And then you return to your object of meditation, your mind. And you do this over and over again. And through doing that, you develop this deep understanding of yourself. It's almost like psychotherapy in some sense. It's really extremely powerful. And you also develop understanding of the world. You actually see everything that's bubbling up, and you see how your mind works. You see how you affect things and how things affect you. It's extremely powerful. And in doing that, then that's how you begin to see things as they really are. And you develop a type of understanding. And there's certain Buddhist types of understanding that are very important. The most important thing is that you see how everything is changing, how there's nothing permanent. Impermanence, the changing nature of the world, is the most important thing to be aware of. But you will directly see that yourself in these sort of mindfulness meditations. Now, the third thing I was going to talk about, so we talked about cessation of suffering. The cause of suffering are actually what are known as kleshas in Sanskrit. And this is usually translated in two ways. It's usually translated as delusions or afflictions. And actually, the reason why there's sort of two translations is because these things are sort of both. An example, the three root delusions or afflictions, kleshas, are attachment, essentially greed, lust is one of them. The second one is hatred, ill will. And the third one is sort of ignorance or delusion, being confused. And those are sort of the three root kleshas. There's other things like jealousy and all sorts of things, but these three sort of encompass everything, because it's either, and there are all sort of forms of attachment. We're either attached to something, we love something, a spouse or a friend or or some beautiful object or money or greed, we just absolutely got to have it. And it's actually it's actually the attachment, which is the painful aspect, which is the negative aspect. It's that feeling that we got to have it and we can't live without it. And hatred and ill will is basically the inversion of that. It's still a form of attachment, but we're attached to ourselves and we're saying, oh, I don't like this. So we push it away. And that's where all of our hatred and ill will and negativity toward other people and other objects come. Oh, this is disgusting. I can't stand. I don't want any of this near me. And we get attached to pushing it away. It's like we can't live with this thing next to us. And the confusion or ignorance is sort of the root, actually, of it all. And the reason why these other two attachments arise is because we don't understand the world as it really is. And that's why all of these things arise. And we're confused about the nature of the world. We think something is going to make us happy, and it really just brings us suffering. And what Buddha said is that actually most sensual pleasure almost always makes us become attached to it. And as soon as we become attached to it, that's what causes pain, because of the nature of change. When we become attached to it, we've got to have it forever. But since the world always changes, we can't have it forever. And it always causes suffering when we lose it. And so even wonderful, beautiful things cause us a lot of suffering because we worry about it. Oh, is somebody going to steal it? Is somebody going to damage it? Even precious things like even children bring us suffering, even though children are the most wonderful thing in the world for us. Nonetheless, we worry about them. Are they going to suffer? What's going to happen to them? Are they going to get harmed in some way? So are they going to get sick or whatever? So everything, so that's where all of our pain comes from, is this attachment. Buddha did give this analogy, which I mentioned in an earlier class, which I think is a very beautiful one. He said that sensual pleasure is like spreading honey on the edge of the sharpest knife you can imagine. It's like the honey is good, the honey is delicious, but he said, can you lick off that honey without cutting your tongue? The cutting part is the attachment, and it's very difficult for us to become to not become attached when we see extremely beautiful things or whatever. And that's where this mindfulness comes in, very helpful. Because in mindfulness, you're totally aware of everything that's happened in the moment, but you're not attaching to it. It's like you're just observing it. You're not attaching to it. So the goal is actually to practice mindfulness 24 hours a day. So you're always mindful. And so when you're mindful, it's like, oh, well, you can enjoy the honey. But because everything is in the moment, you don't expect it to last long. You're just enjoying it in the moment. And then the next thing happens and the next thing. And it's the same way. And bad, things that are disgusting or whatever don't bother you. They're just things that are there. And so anyway, that's sort of the idea of these kleshas. And the other aspect of these kleshas is the reason for calling them afflictions is they disturb the mind. And in fact, that's always a good sort of sign to ask yourself. You can ask yourself, is there a kleshas or one of these afflictions or delusions happening to my mind right now? If your mind is disturbed, the probability is high that there is something operating. because it's all of these, it's the attachment which makes us excitable, which makes us worry, which makes us, it's like worry is a form of, being attached and suffering. So all of these things, when we're attached, it's this attachment that causes all of these problems. And the other aspect of all of these delusions, part of the way they operate, which is very important, is they almost always involve exaggeration. The reason we become attached to things is this mental proliferation I was talking about, this idea that our mind adds stuff to it. So we see some person and we totally fall in love with that person. We can't be without that person. And why do we do that? We do that because we exaggerate all of that person's good qualities and we forget about all of their negative qualities. Or we see some beautiful object, and we see some beautiful object, we see all of the beautiful aspects of it. We don't see anything negative about it. And that's what we do. Or it works inversely for things we hate. So if we have an enemy, we always see are the negative qualities of that enemy. We can't imagine that they have any good qualities whatsoever. And that's the way our mind works. Our mind, is so affected by our ego, by what we like or dislike, that it just unconsciously adds all of this stuff or subtracts all of this stuff that we don't see. And that's why it's important to see the world as it really is, because if we see things as they really are, then it helps us in this battle against attachment, whether positive or negative. And that's what wisdom is. That's what knowledge is. And that's a process. Again, that's a process that we're worked through. But this mindfulness meditation is very powerful in that, because if you're doing the mindfulness meditation correctly, then you start to see things without the ego stuff being added. And so then you begin to see things more clearly. You see both the positive and the negative sides. You don't add in all this exaggeration and stuff like that. So in one sense, in one sutra, the sutras were the recordings of what Buddha taught. When he went around teaching, people memorized his teachings, and then later on they wrote them down. Those are what the sutras are. So in one sutra, when the Buddha was giving a teaching, he actually said that another way of describing nirvana or enlightenment is removing all of these kleshas, all of these delusions and afflictions. When you have permanently removed all of these delusions or afflictions, these are your negativities in your mind. At that point, you have achieved enlightenment. And so there are some ways of temporarily suppressing these things in deep meditations, but those aren't enlightenment. Enlightenment means removing them forever. And to do that, it means that you develop this deep understanding, I said, that I was talking about, that is so deep that there's no way that they can arise anymore. You can't see, these delusions or afflictions are a distorted way of looking at the world. And there's no way you can see when you have such a deep understanding of the world as it really is, you can't distort the world anymore. So these things just never arise ever again. And so that's another way of talking about nirvana. Okay, so that's that. So let's talk a little bit more about nirvana. So talking about a little bit more nirvana is, I think, well, actually, I pretty much said it all. It's, we can only describe it sort of negatively, because how can you describe something you've never experienced? We just don't have words for it. All of our words point to common experiences. We all eat things, we have names of foods. So all the things that are in our common experience, we have words for. So if you've never experienced nirvana, how can you talk about it? So essentially all we can say, what the Buddha did say, is the Buddha said that it's extremely blissful. It's the greatest bliss of all. So in a certain sense, happiness is bliss. There is actually 4 famous seals of Buddhism where it said nirvana is peace. That was another statement made about nirvana. And that actually reflects on these sort of kleshas also, these delusions, afflictions, because we've talked mainly about suffering, but what about happiness? Because happiness is sort of bound up in nirvana, Because nirvana, one way of talking about nirvana is it's the most perfect happiness. And the one thing about deep levels of happiness is they're extremely peaceful. And the Buddha actually described this. And in fact, what the Buddha said, that you can sort of experience all of this stuff yourself in deep meditations, especially the single pointed type of meditations, where you develop incredible deep levels of certain, actually these things they call jhanas, were very deep states of deeper and deeper, more powerful forms of concentration. And what you discover, what happens when you develop these things, is your mind gets more and more peaceful, and it becomes more and more blissful. And what you discover, and in fact, one of the monks that started our tradition talked about this. He said, oh, if you knew about the bliss of some of these deep meditation states, that's all you would do is meditate day and night, forget food, forget sex, forget anything. None of these things can touch how blissful these things are. Amazing. So in that sense, but that's the way it is. And as the Buddha described it, it's like you reach such deep levels of bliss that they go beyond even happiness. He talks about them becoming more equanimity. It's like they become so peaceful that they're just absolutely amazing. But again, it's not something that you have to believe Buddha. If you go out and learn to develop these deep meditations, you'll discover these things. And in fact, there are Buddhists who become addicted to meditation because it is so blissful. And in fact, Buddha said that, the most blissful existence on earth is in these deep meditations because they're so amazing. And so it is something that, again, we don't have a lot of words to put out, but it is something you discover. And even in beginning stages of meditation, if you practice regularly, there will be certain times when you just sort of feel this sort of deep happiness, this sort of deep peace, amazing peace and bliss. And this is the thing that is really satisfying. The problem of ordinary sensual pleasure is that it's always dissatisfying. And one way it's dissatisfying is because you can never get enough. You take one bite, you want the next, you become addicted to it. Almost everything that's extremely pleasurable is extraordinarily addictive. And then your mind is agitated. Oh, I'm so worried. Where's my next hit going to come from of bliss? And you worry. Whereas these sort of deep forms of meditation, it's just satisfying. It's just wonderful. It's just like you sink into it and you just experience it. And again, it's this total peacefulness that's extraordinary. But again, there's no way you have to go do it yourself. It's like everything in Buddhism. In Buddhism, you have to take responsibility for your own life. We have all of the teachers and monks and, very holy people to help us along the way, to give us their advice and so forth. But ultimately, you have to go do it yourself. And of course, the way Buddhism really works is, for most people, you go to teachings or you read books, you learn about Buddhism. But then what you have to do is you have to take the teachings and put them into practice. And you have to experience them for yourself. And I would say that there's sort of two forms of practice. One form of practice is trying to generate this mindfulness into your ordinary life, to extend it from mindfulness meditation into the rest of your life. So you start seeing when you're negative, when your mind is negative or disturbed, and you keep trying to just overtly change that. And I've done that for a long time. If it's like I'm married, I have wife, kids, when you have that, of course my kids are all grown up now. I'm retired, but anyway, it's like when you're living next to a person, there's always friction. The other person will always irritate you one way or another. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to remove that irritation, trying to never get irritated, because, you begin to see this irritation is one of these kleshas, and the irritation then leads to being upset, to being angry, to all of these other negative things. And so actually it's, and if you can extend mindfulness to your day-to-day life, minute by minute, you can begin to dampen down some of these things, and especially watch them. If this sort of mindfulness attitude, watch them, see how they disturb your mind, see how they're actually not pleasant. That they're not helpful, they're not good, they're not a good way of living. And so that's one way of doing it. And Buddhism actually gives a lot of tips and techniques for doing this also. A lot of these things are just ways of thinking about what's happening, which can be very helpful for you in calming your mind and seeing things. And I don't, in this short course, I can't go into all of that, but there's lots of courses on these things. And the other way, of course, is meditation, both single-pointed and mindfulness, because that's where you really develop your mind, and that's where you develop your strength of mind, and that's where you develop deeper understandings. And what I find too is that for me, I try to, it's, in busy lives, it's hard to, even when you're retired, your life becomes busy. You have grandkids, other things take up a lot of time, which is wonderful. But anyway, life always fills up. But even there, so I try to meditate about an hour a day, half hour in the morning, half hour in the evening. And I find that twofold. One, it's very blissful when I meditate. It's really calming. It makes you feel wonderful. And the second thing is that over time, I feel like insights come. You really do just begin to understand things better. It's like all of the teachings that you read and study start to slowly clarify, and they start to make more sense, and you start to put them together. And so anyway, that's mainly how you practice. And then the Mahayanas will talk, there are additional extensions, but that's sort of the main path. And again, as my goal is just to be a better person every day. It's like, if I can become a better person every day, remove my negativities of mind, and slowly become happier and happier. And when you do that, as you go longer and longer in the practice, it becomes easier to deal with big problems in your life. There's always things that happen to you in life. Somebody runs into your car, or you get sick, or whatever. It becomes easier and easier to deal with these large problems because you have a calm mind, and it's amazing. But again, it's something you have to experience for yourself. Okay. And okay. So the only other thing that I should mention, looking at my list of things, is that one reason you can say, well, why is it possible to remove these negativities from our mind? And one important thing is the reason why it's possible is because none of these negativities are a permanent part of our mind. And in fact, as I told you, everything in life is impermanent. Even our negativities are impermanent. So everything can change. And because everything that can change, that's why it's possible to remove it all. And then when you hit ultimate nirvana or bliss, that's when you develop the causes never to be reborn again into this world of ours, which is called samsara. What the Buddha always said is anything that's born dies, and death is always a suffering. And so if you're going to remove all suffering, then you have to remove death, which means you have to remove birth. And so when you achieve full nirvana, you can achieve nirvana during this lifetime, but you still have this physical body. Then when this physical body dies, you are simply never reborn again in samsara, in this world of ours. And who knows where we go to then? All we know is it's a state of great bliss, because you approach these deep levels of bliss and deep levels of meditation, and you can gradually see how blissful they are. And the Buddha himself said these things are amazingly blissful. So anyway, we will be in some state of great bliss, but it's beyond anything we can describe because it's not in our world. So anyway, that's the idea. That's basically how it works. Okay, so now let me move on to the Mahayana path. So as I said before, in the Mahayana path, at least in the Tibetan tradition, the way that people talk about the path, and this is more generally true of all Buddhist traditions, is when I was going through the history, I talked about how sometime roughly around the the birth of Christ, roughly around, Buddha lived roughly 500 BC. So about 500 years later, a new strain of Buddhism started developing, which was the Mahayana path. And the people who are Mahayana means great vehicle, Maha, great, Yana, vehicle, the great path. And they insultingly referred to the earlier people as Hinayana, people of the lesser vehicle. Nowadays, people are a little more sensitized, and we don't tend to use that terminology. But anyway, that was a terminology that you'll find in all the books. But they refer to the Mahayana, but now people refer to the Hinayanas, Theravadins, the elders. And for the most part, as I went through the history of Buddhism, eventually the Mahayana took over. And it was the Mahayana path that spread to all of these different countries. The original Hinayana path spread mainly south to southern India and to Sri Lanka, which used to be called Ceylon. It's this island off the south tip of India. And then it also spread from there into Burma and sort of related places all around those, Thailand, all of those places. And so the Theravadan is basically the as close as can be possible to sort of the original form of Buddhism that Buddha taught. Of course, after 2,500 years, it changed and slowly modified. So it evolved just like all forms of Buddhism. But anyway, so there is that sort of original thing. But that's about the only Hinayana Buddhism that's left in the world. Pretty much all of the other Buddhism all around the world is Mahayana. So Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, all of the other forms of Buddhism in China, Korea, and so forth are all Mahayana Buddhism. And so the question is so what is Mahayana Buddhism and what does that mean? And in my view, the Mahayana Buddhism is, I think the best way to look at it is as an extension of the original Buddhism, or more sort of an emphasis. From the very early days, it was very clear that many people around Buddha were becoming what was called enlightened or achieving nirvana. And however, these people were called arahants or arhats, depending on which language, Pali or Sanskrit you're in. But anyway, these people clearly did not have the same ability as Buddha. So it developed this idea that there's actually a gradation in enlightenment. So in enlightenment, you've removed all the negativities, you're never reborn. But clearly they're looking at the original Buddha, how he had omniscience and all sorts of these special powers and knew so much more than all the other people knew, that it was clear that just becoming enlightened there's more to it than that. And so I think that's sort of how the Mahayana school sort of developed, is the Mahayana school said, actually we should look for a higher perfection, because clearly the Buddha is more perfect than the arhats or arhats. And so that should be our goal. And there's more to it than that, but that's sort of a beginning part. So it's this notion that we should look for a higher thing. So in a certain sense, the Mahayana path is sort of, in a way, embedded in the original Buddhism. But then it evolved from there. And the most important thing in Mahayana Buddhism is a notion called bodhicitta, which I'm going to have to, of course, that's what I'm going to spend the rest of our time today on. And so there's a deeper logic to all of this also. And some of the deeper logic has to do with this notion of compassion for everyone else. And so before I go there, let me just mention terminology. So in the Mahayana Buddhism, we distinguish between full enlightenment, the enlightenment of a perfect Buddha, with what we call liberation, which sometimes people call a small nirvana or sort of a lesser enlightenment, because you become, in a sense, liberated from samsara, you achieve nirvana. So nirvana means liberated from samsara, but still you haven't achieved the same perfection as a higher Buddha. And so in the Mahayana path, when we talk about enlightenment, we usually mean the full enlightenment. That's exactly the same as Buddha Shakyamuni, the original Buddha. Okay. So anyway, so getting that terminology. So the notion of bodhicitta is, let me just give the definition of it. So the definition of bodhicitta is the wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of others. So there's two parts to it. One is the wish for us to achieve full enlightenment, meaning this more perfect enlightenment. But the second goal is not so that we can be more blissful or more perfect. It's because we care about all the other, what we call sentient beings. By sentient beings, we mean beings with a mind. And in Buddhism, we go beyond humans. Animals are considered, even insects, that's the hard part for most people. And there are also people in other realms. There are, yeah, go ahead. Let me unmute you, sorry. Okay, go ahead, you can unmute now.
Would you consider, like entities or phenomena like trees and, trees are known to communicate with each other, aren't they? And mushrooms, the fungi
Yes,
network
yeah,
underground. And would you
yeah, that,
would Buddhism or, consider them to be sentient beings?
okay, yeah, this isn't my choice, but in
Yeah.
Buddhism and according to Buddha, they are not sentient beings. They don't have a mind. So they're living things. They are living things, but they can't think. They in Buddhism, they don't really. You're never reborn as a tree. Maybe that's a way of thinking about it. Because among sentient beings, we can all be reborn. And there's godlike states of sentient beings. In fact, many different types of godlike beings. There's hell beings, and there's also something called hungry ghosts or hungry spirits, which is another thing. And there are animals. There's lower realms where one suffers more greatly, and there's higher rooms where we suffer more godlike beings. And that all depends, of course, on the karma we create. And of course, even within each of these realms, there's a gradation. There are some humans that live more like a godlike thing, never get sick, have lots of money. There are some humans who have hellish-like existences. So, and it's the same for animals. Some of our dogs and cats have very heavenly-like existences as animals. And other ones, they suffer greatly out in the wild and so forth. So yeah, but all of these things that we can, and in Buddhism, we can be reborn in any of these realms. It's considered, the human realm is considered the best for achieving enlightenment. Because in the lower realms, you suffer too much to really do spiritual teachings. And in the higher realms, the godlike realms, you're so blissed up that you don't care about, you just want to be blissed, you're total pleasure, it's like, it's hard to avoid it. And humans have enough suffering to remind us why we need to practice, but we also have enough freedom. We have well-developed minds and we have enough freedom to spiritually practice. So it's considered that if you want to be reborn, you want to be reborn as a human, as opposed to a godlike or anything else realm. So you think you'd want to go to the godlike realms, but basically you don't. Because the problem is that if you go to the godlike realms, as you're enjoying these immense pleasures, you're burning up all of your karma, all of your positive karma. And when that positive karma is burnt up, you fall back down to the lower realms. And if you're in the lower realms, you hope to build yourself up to the higher realms. And in Buddhism, it's said that the Buddha said he didn't see any beginning to any of our lives in samsara. So essentially, the belief is that each of us has spent time in the God realms and the hell realms and everywhere in between. And it doesn't do you any good, because everything in samsara changes. If you're in a godlike room, it's not permanent. You don't get to stay there forever. Things change and you lose it. And in fact, it's almost worse to have a wonderful existence and then lose it. So that the whole point of Buddhism is nirvana. Let's escape from this samsara. That's the only way we can have permanent happiness. Everything within our samsara always changes, and it's always uncertain, and we can't depend on anything. So that's why we have to achieve nirvana. Now, in the Mahayana Buddhism, the idea of it is that you might actually become liberated from samsara, but instead of disappearing from samsara, at that point you have enough powers that you can deliberately choose to be reborn in samsara. So then, in the Mahayana path, once we achieve liberation, we continue to be reborn in samsara so that we can do this extra super duper perfectionism that brings us to full enlightenment. And because while we are still within samsara, we're better able to help the other sentient beings within it. And so I will give you, so the logic of the bodhicitta path is this, is that it's a purely selfless path. So this notion of bodhicitta starts from actually just thinking about the people around you. You think about, your parents, your mother, your father, your brothers or sisters, if you have anything, close relatives, good friends, people you like. When you see these people, you develop compassion for them. You say, how can I go off to this blissful state of nirvana and leave all the rest of these people behind to suffer? That's really terrible. How can I live with myself to, not help them too? And so the Mahayana path is driven by this great compassion. And compassion means literally the wish to remove the suffering of others. So you develop this great wish to help all the other people also achieve nirvana or remove all their suffering. And then you ask, how can I do that? And you decide that, as an ordinary being, there's not much we can do. We can be friendly. We can, if people are sick, we can give them meals. We can take care of them. But actually none of that does any real good because they're still going to continue to be reborn in samsara. And so as long as they're born in samsara, they're never safe. They're always going to have suffering. So you realize that the only way to really help them is to help them also achieve nirvana, liberation from samsara, freedom from all of their suffering. And to do that, the only way that you can do that is by ourselves becoming great spiritual beings. And you can sort of see that, if you look at somebody like the Dalai Lama, some of these deep spiritual leaders, they often have enormous ability to benefit people. And they can benefit large numbers of people, which as an ordinary being, we can't be. And so if you extrapolate this sort of logic to its limit, you decide, actually, if I'm really going to help all these people, I need to become a Buddha myself, because the Buddha is the greatest spiritual power that there exists. And so you make this determination. I'm going to become a Buddha so that I can help all of these other people. And that's what bodhicitta is, the wish to become enlightened so that we can best help everyone else become enlightened. And it's interesting, in the Mahayana path, it's believed that eventually everyone will become enlightened. Even the people who just went off and just became liberated from samsara, and that's called achieving solitary peace. That's the language they use. Solitary peace means that you yourself is sitting there all by yourself, happy, blissful, but you're not helping anybody. And so the Mahayana path is seen as a higher path, because it's seen as a higher path to wish to help people. And it's said that eventually all of the Buddhas will go to all of these solitary people in bliss and help them also become fully enlightened as well. So eventually everyone will become fully enlightened. However, it may take a few eons or billions of eons or eons of eons. That part is not clear. But at any rate, that's basically the idea of the Mahayana path. And it's quite interesting. And so you can ask yourself, why is this? And the other thing that's pointed out is that this bodhicitta path is actually extremely powerful. And you can ask, well, why is it so powerful? And the idea of it, sort of the logic of it, again, there's a logic to everything in Buddhism. In Buddhism, everything, the more you learn, everything sort of makes more and more sense and fits together. And so the idea of this Mahayana path is that you say, well, it takes to purify yourself, takes enormous positive karma. Because again, nothing happens, everything is cause and effect. And if you want good things to happen, you have to achieve good karma. And when that good karma ripens, that's what helps you actually increase your spiritual path. So even in all forms of Buddhism, things like giving, generosity, doing good works, benefiting others, helps generate positive karma. And not only does it help us experience more physical pleasure in life, but it also helps us advance along the spiritual path. And so in the Mahayana path, what you do is you learn to generalize all these feelings of compassion and so forth so that they include every single sentient being. And in fact, you don't achieve full bodhicitta until you have what they call great compassion, compassion for every single sentient being without exception. So every single, no matter how good or bad they are, you have compassion. You wish to free everyone from suffering. And so what happens is that once you develop this intention, this motivation, so that it's omnipresent, always present in your mind, every single moment of your life, this is all you're thinking about, is great compassion. When you do that, then everything you do has this intention of benefiting all sentient beings. And if you think about it, you can imagine helping, one person. Maybe there's a little old lady struggling to cross the street and you help her. So you generate a certain amount of positive karma for doing that. Well, what happens if you could help two little old lady crossing the street? Well, you generate twice as much, 3, maybe 100, maybe you could bring whole hordes across to generate even more. But the way it works with bodhicitta is you don't have to do that, because every single act you do is for all sentient beings. So for nearly an infinite number of groups of people. So everything you're doing at each moment is generating nearly infinite positive karma. And so it generates enormous amounts of positive karma. And in fact, that's the reason why you can go to this higher level of perfection, because a Buddha is pretty much an infinite being. So you need almost infinite merit to become such an infinite being. So how can you generate such infinite merit? Well, you generate acts that each of them are almost infinite in merit. And so that's sort of the idea, that's sort of the logic behind the whole thing, is that it has this, this universal applicability. It becomes, almost every act becomes infinite amounts of merit. And so now let me go a little bit more deeper into bodhicitta, because these are just sort of general concerns. So there is different levels of bodhicitta, and the Mahayana path, there's a whole hierarchy of thing, but just to simplify it, there's sort of aspiring bodhicitta. So there are people who start the Mahayana path, who develop this wish to develop, reduce all the suffering of all sentient beings by themselves becoming a Buddha and working on their own spiritual path. And that's sort of aspiring, because it's aspiring because it's just basically a wish. But nonetheless, that wish is still very powerful and very strong, but it's not the real, they call it sort of artificial bodhicitta. It's not the real thing, because it's just sort of this wishy-washy wish. You don't know how our wishes come and go. It's not solid. It's not really completely there. So the thing that you really need is real bodhicitta. And real bodhicitta is a state which they sometimes call spontaneous bodhicitta. So when you reach a state of spontaneous bodhicitta or real bodhicitta or engaging bodhicitta, it means that your bodhicitta is just there spontaneously every minute, every second of your life. You're never without it. And so, of course, you have to go through a procedure to develop this. It's like in Buddhism, nothing just, it just doesn't fall out of the sky into your lap and suddenly you have real bodhicitta. And of course, the way you do it is you is you go through a spiritual training where you begin with this aspiring bodhicitta, but then you develop and you make it stronger and stronger and stronger. At a certain point, it crosses over a threshold, and then it becomes spontaneous or real. And it actually takes a very strong mind to develop this. You actually have to develop a certain level of very deep concentration called calm abiding first, because until you develop that, your mind isn't stable enough to actually make this thing firm enough. But that's again a little more detail. But the end point of this is, so how does this work? And so I think I'm going to describe one of these methods very roughly. I've got 15 minutes, so I can't go into great detail, but I think it helps to have a little bit of the detail of what is the method you go through. And in the Mahayana path, there are sort of two major methods for achieving bodhicitta. One is for people who are very spiritually advanced, and that's called equalizing and exchanging self with others. But the second one is I think the more common one that we all start off with, which is called sevenfold cause and effect. And of course, both of these methods overlap a lot. So it's, they're not entirely distinct. But anyway, what I'm going to describe is the sevenfold cause and effect, because it breaks it down into simple steps. And I think this is it's almost like a paradigm for how you achieve spiritual practice in any form of Buddhism. Because it shows how one goes and directly tries to work on your mind step by step to change yourself. Because you have to change yourself to develop this bodhicitta. So the way you begin is first you develop what's known as equanimity. And there's a lot of different forms of equanimity in Buddhism, depending on what the context of the teaching is. But this form of equanimity is just feeling equally about people. So when you have this form of equanimity, it's like you don't greatly love this person or hate this person. You basically just like all people roughly. It's just they're all the same. You don't have deep loves or thing. And there's a thought process, meditations that you do to develop this kind of equanimity. And basically it involves just seeing that we're all the same. We all want to be happy. We all want to avoid suffering. And because of that, we're all the same. And so that's what equanimity are. It just means that we're all the same. And you begin to see that very deeply. And you do specific meditations to develop this equanimity. And then the next stage is, and this is the odd one that I think throws most people, but basically the idea of it is that you have to develop affection for people, because otherwise you're never going to want to help them. And so the second stage is a trick for helping yourself develop affection for people. And the trick of it is to realize that all sentient beings are your mothers. So when you first hear that, it sounds odd, but the idea of it is that if we've been around almost for infinite lifetimes, at some point or every single lifetime, you have a mother and father. So at every single lifetime, you ask yourself, where are those mothers and fathers? And they're all the other sentient beings. And if you've been around pretty much forever, then at one point or another, almost every other sentient being at one point has been either your mother or your father, probably many, many times. And among those many times that they've been their mother and father, even though some people have mothers and fathers that they deeply hate, at one of those times, they were probably a wonderful mother and father, this paradigm thing, that we used to see in the 1950s, the great mother that everybody loved. It's like all these TV shows in the 50s always had these amazing mothers. And so at one point you had a wonderful mother who just absolutely loved you to pieces, took care of you, would sacrifice her life for you. And having realized that, you remember that kindness. Because what happens when people have been kind to us, we automatically develop a wish to repay that kindness. It's like we almost can't stop ourselves. When somebody is really nice to you, it's almost like a human repulse. We want to repay that kindness. So remembering the kindness of these other mother sentient beings, we develop the wish to repay that kindness. And on top of that, we develop affectionate love. You know, if we have an amazing, wonderful mother, we always deeply love such a mother. I think it's easier to deal. You could do this with fathers, I guess, but they traditionally do it with mothers because there's so much a greater connection with mothers. Because mothers, I think, more directly care for their children for the most part. So anyway, so if you think about this, so if you think every single mother sentient being out there at one time has been this wonderful mother, then I should love this sentient being. And you can say, well, you know, but this sentient being may have been my mother, you know, 50 billion years ago. Why should I love her now? But it doesn't work that way, because in our current life, if we have a mother, and if you're an older person like me, although maybe even sometimes younger people, you know, if we have good mothers, they die. And when they die, we don't lose our love for them. We still continue to love them. So even if you had this mother 50 billion years ago, you should still continue to love her. So it sort of means it helps us develop, again, it's this trick. It helps us develop affection, love for each and every single sentient being. So we develop this affectionate love for everyone without exception. Because even if they've been horrible since that time, at one time, they did these amazing things for us, and we need to repay it. So we develop this love. And then once you have this love, that's how you develop compassion. Because if there is someone who you deeply love, you can't stand to see them suffering. You know, it's like if a mother sees her child drowning in a lake or the ocean, you know, they'll do anything to save their child. You know, they have this, they can't stand to see their child suffer. And so anyone that we deeply love, we can never stand to see them suffer. So wishing to free others from suffering is what compassion means, is the definition of compassion. So once we develop this affectionate love for every sentient being, then we develop great compassion, because every single sentient being at one time has been our loving mother. And we develop, you know, through meditate, again, we do specific meditations to develop this. We develop this great compassion where it becomes almost, it's like we almost can't bear it. We can't stand it, see anyone suffer. And it's just, and it just becomes extremely strong. And then, but we go beyond that. So bodhicitta actually goes, you would think that would be the end of it, but actually there's more to it. And that's because we have to get to this part of wishing to become enlightened, and we haven't reached that part. So we've developed the great compassion part, but we haven't got the other part yet. So the final steps of this process are develop this other part. And that's what happens in the next stage. In the next stage, after having developed this strong feeling that we can't stand to see any sentient being suffer, you know, it comes to the point where we just make this strong decision. You know, it's not okay for me to sit in the sidelines and watch this. I myself have to do something about this. You know, it's like the mother seeing her child drowning. You know, even if the mother can't swim, she'll go out and try to save her child. You know, you can't stop yourself. You have to act. And so that's where the final step of bodhicitta comes, because that's the point where we determine we absolutely have to become enlightened, because all these people are suffering and I can't stand it. And the only real way I can help them is by becoming fully enlightened, perfectly enlightened. And so that's what bodhicitta is about. And this other path, equalizing self with others, is similar, but it's faster, it's shorter, and it takes more maturity, more spiritual maturity. and of course, the reason why you have two paths is because we are reborn. And sometimes we've been great spiritual beings in our earlier lives. And so we come very mature, spiritually mature into this life. And you can sort of see that. You can see some people are just from birth are more spiritually mature. And that's because they were more spiritually mature earlier, and they've carried it forward into this life. And so in this faster, you know, more succinct method, essentially you start off with the notion of equality. Again, we're all the same. There's no difference between you and me. You know, everything in our lives are impermanent. whether we have money or don't have money, whether we're beautiful or ugly, all of that's impermanent. It's irrelevant. There's, as we say, there's no real permanent self. We're just this ongoing process of constantly changing. And so there's nothing to make us better or worse than anybody else. We're all the same. We all want to be happy and we all don't want to suffer. So once you develop this notion really, really clearly, then you develop the notion, you look at the disadvantages of self-cherishing and the advantages of cherishing others. And so once you develop this notion, you just decide, there's no way that I can harm you to better myself, because I'm not better than you are. So why should I get all the good things and you get all the crummy things? And why should I harm you so I can get better things? Because I don't deserve it any more than you do. We all deserve it equally. And then what you begin to see is all the self-cherishing, the sort of, your ego, looking at yourself, putting yourself ahead of everybody else. And you look at that, and as you look at that really closely, you see that leads to all of your suffering. That's all of this attachment. This ego self-cherishing is just another way of saying attachment. It's like we want it all and we don't want any bad things. And that creates these negative states of mind that are suffering, that are negative. And so we say, oh, that's a bad thing to do. And you look at the other thing, you look at cherishing others. And what you decide is you see that every time you help somebody, it actually makes you feel really good. And it's absolutely wonderful to help other people. And you begin to see how, if you want to lead a happy, blissful life, it's good to help more and more people. And that's where you develop this third notion, which is called, it has this funny title, exchanging self of others, is how they describe it. And what this means is that doesn't mean like, oh, I'm going to walk in your shoes or something like that. What it means is changing your object of cherishing. So our normal selfish, egotistical mode is to always cherish ourselves, for ourselves always to try to go first in line, to get all the best stuff, so forth. And we work toward that. So that's called cherishing yourself. So we flip that. So we change our object of cherishing from ourselves to others. So then we put everybody else first. You want everybody else to go first in line ahead of you. And you yourself want to, and then when you do that, that's basically what bodhicitta is. Because that causes you to wish to, put everybody first, to help everybody, benefit everybody else first. And that's why when often you go to big Buddhist events, it can sometimes be disconcerting. Everybody else is trying to push you forward ahead of line. There's a lot of funny things about Buddhism, but it sort of comes from this notion of equalizing self with others. And so, okay, so I think I'm going to have to stop here. There's more to the Mahayana path. There's more practices. There's called the 6 perfections, which are sort of more specific practices that you follow as a bodhisattva. So when you develop this bodhicitta, you become a bodhisattva, a bodhi being. Sattva is a being, and bodhi means for enlightenment, a being who's bound for enlightenment, so you can help all of the sentient beings. And the Buddha himself at one time referred to his previous lives as being a bodhisattva. So that's where the terminology came from. So anyway, so I never run over, because it's people spend their precious time, and it disturbs them if I run over, and I don't want to drag it on. But we've got plenty of time to finish everything. So next time we will finish some more of essentially everything else are extensions of the Mahayana path. So finishing these 6 perfections, this mind training, talking about this mind training is very, very powerful, amazing, wonderful techniques. And a little bit about what is Tantric Buddhism about, and why would you want to do that? And most people have huge misconceptions about that. So I'll try to give, it's a very deep, complicated thing, but I will try to talk about that. Let me just see if I'm, Oh, okay. So we did have some questions that I missed because I was talking too much. Oh, you don't mind? Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay. So anyway, but you can ask the same questions next time, because everything in Buddhism comes up over and over again. And if you start talking about one thing, before long, you're talking about everything. So you always cover all of Buddhism, no matter where you start, you always end up covering the whole thing. So it's just because everything is just so interconnected. So is there any more quick questions now? Are we okay? Okay, good. So next time we will continue, and that will be the fourth and final class, and we'll try to wrap things up and talk about these other topics, then answer any final questions. So anyway, thank you for coming, and we didn't get disturbed at all. So that's great. Thank you all. So I will hopefully see you next week. Bye.